So if I could move then finally to the issue of legislation, which has generated quite a lot of interest, but as we've repeatedly said, is only one of the many things that we need to consider. Would you agree with a sort of a summary of our thinking, or the thinking presented to us around legislation? Well, firstly, that for many of the proposed measures, it would be necessary to have legislation, otherwise the measures wouldn't even be possible, whether they are takedown measures or demonetization measures or apologies or clarifications. And that a number of the legal experts, professors and students have now clarified that there are gaps in the law as it exists today, and that we would need some legal measures to close those gaps. To address the problems of today, let alone potential problems that we would have in the future. Further, that if we are going to have legislative tools, these tools need to address the issue that of intent behind people spreading material that may or may not be malicious, it may or may not be deliberate, the harm or potential real-world consequences of the material that are under consideration, not the falsity per se, but the potential harm in the real world. And that the structure should allow for fair commentary and public discourse and parody and satire and comedy, all the necessary things that we want as part of society. But that legislation, that getting the legislation right is really part of government's responsibility in this space. It's not enough just to make statements of intent and on top of that invest. We actually have a responsibility to get our legislation right around this space. That the tools of legislation, if any, should deal with the speed and impact that deliberate online falsehoods might have. That any process needs to have routes of redress, appeal, and judicial oversight to ensure that it's fair, it's balanced, it's appropriately enacted. And that it gets the balance right between the positive and negative liberties of freedom of speech, was one of the characterizations one of the witnesses put, and that we are then potentially can restore a better function to the marketplace of ideas. So if we are to have legislation, that would be the kind of envelope of parameters that the legislation needs to be shaped within. Would that be something broadly that you all could agree with, or do you have further comment on potential legislation that we might have to consider?
Again, from the consumer's perspective, I think there will certainly be some fears that, for example, if I share unwittingly an online falsehood, will I then be charged? And these are, again, the kinds of pressures on consumers on their media literacy, right? They start to be a little bit paranoid, they start to be a little bit overcautious, and that's where the whole idea of the legislation must be quite clear about the intent of the perpetrator. And so that's where I would like to exercise a little bit of caution that if we are going to introduce legislation, that we should also be able to educate the lay consumer as to what their responsibilities are and what their potential liabilities are.
But broadly, you would agree with the potential sort of shape of what the legislation could and shouldn't, or would or wouldn't do that I've just described?
Yes.
I have a couple of concerns when it comes to legislation. I say in my submission that I think legislation is required because this is a very serious threat for all the points that Dr. Janil have made about the speed of the threat, the evolution. So I think one concern I have is I'm not a lawyer, so obviously I wouldn't have a concrete solution to propose. But one issue I'm concerned about is the flexibility of this of any laws that get put into place to evolve with the threat. We're talking about online falsehoods today. You know, I don't know whether that will evolve in the future, you know, to a different type of platform that is, you know, of a different form of technology or something like that. I can't necessarily postulate into the future, but you know, how fast will our laws be able to evolve with something like that? Which then led me to another point about that's why we need a multi-pronged strategy. It's not necessarily just laws, but our laws should have some element of that. The other point that I wanted to make was that we're in a space where we are contesting the hearts and minds of people, where emotions are involved. So when we put together a legislative framework, when we do measures like this select committee as well, I think the ability to communicate this in a way that people understand, accept, trust, and believe in is going to be crucial. we see too many examples of governments around the world who, either through ham-fisted, communication efforts or non-communication efforts, fail to gain the kind of popular support for the good things that they're trying to do, and then it backfires. And I think that this is because this is laws that pertain to winning the hearts and minds of news consumers. Being able to communicate these ideas, the principles behind, the context, the aims and the measures becomes even more crucial. It is precisely in a space where good communication is required. These laws pertain to communication and to news, and hopefully they are communicated in the right way.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for your comments and your submissions, and for appearing before us and for your patience. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Fang and Professor Lim for coming before the committee, even though it's quite late in the day now. I have a question for Mr. Fang, and this pertains to one of the recommendations that was made in your submission, and something which SMS Janil touched upon, which was the suggestion to move into a model like a not-for-profit model like the BBC. And you spoke about morale issues based on your 18 years experience in newsrooms, and how these compare against courses that you've attended in London at the BBC, where you find the passion and energy of those editors and journalists, even junior journalists, there being much more evident, I would say. In that context, do you think there's a particular reason over and above the current pressures that are faced in newsrooms, be it financially or be it because of the online media, other reasons that explain why there is this difference in passion within the mainstream media in Singapore? I mean, I ask because I'm not in that space, so many of us I don't think are. So would there be any reason? And secondly, in connection with that, I would think it's unlikely that there would be a significant change in the structure to a not-for-profit model, at least in the short term. For your sake, I hope I'm wrong. But assuming we don't get there, are there any other intermediary steps that can be considered to improve the level of energy and passion among the local mainstream media space? And are they concerned about things like OB markers, which explain this lack of passion?
All right. Okay. I got the question. 2 questions. Thank you. I think first and foremost, I wanted to make clear, and I was concerned that maybe in my submission it wasn't necessarily very clear. I think that the issue of morale is not linked to the for-profit structure of the companies. I don't think that's ever been a case. Nobody comes to the journalist and says, one of your KPIs is getting more readers for your articles, otherwise, you don't get a bonus. It's never been a case of that. I think the morale issue is largely linked to the competitive pressures and the general concern that traditional mainstream media is waning in terms of importance, desirability, attractiveness to our audience. I think nobody necessarily wants to work in a vacuum to put out information that nobody reads. Journalists put in really a lot of effort into producing good quality work, and it's just disheartening when you see readership numbers and viewership numbers coming down. And I think that that is the main source of concern. I don't think, and this is again based on my personal experience and it's anecdotal, I don't think there's really the sentiment that you were alluding to about OB markers, about control. In that sense, it is a very popular impression that many people have. I give talks in schools, and there's quite a lot of questions about state control, about mouthpiece, and things like that. And I tell everyone that in my almost 18 years of experience working in journalism, nobody has ever stood behind me and said, "Don't use that word, don't say that thing, don't do that." Is there a certain element of self-censorship? I would say probably there is, because you're not the only one to share some of those concerns, and I think some people within even the media profession are worried about things like that. But nobody has ever, and I tell all the young journalists as well, is that your job is to provide objective reporting, factual, contextual, accurate, and timely. that is what we own. We owe our audience and we owe our consumers, to be able to carry out our duties in that way. And we do see a lot of very young, passionate people who are willing to come in and to work in that space. But it's getting harder and harder to attract and retain that sort of talent going forward. So, okay, that sort of segues nicely into my answer to your second question of what we can do if we can't move into a not-for-profit model for our media industries in Singapore. And I think it's about sending the right signals to the people in the industry and to journalists, to editors, to people who work in that space, that journalistic excellence should be the hallmark of what they do day in, day out, every single day. And one idea that I had was, we have the notion of the Pulitzer Prize as a pinnacle of journalism in major countries. Why don't we have something similar that is for Singapore? Individual media companies have their own internal news awards and annual awards. I think we have platforms like the Asian Television Awards where they give out prizes for news as well. But why can't we have something that recognizes excellence in journalism on a national scale? And I think that this sends a signal not just to people within the news industry, but it also sends a signal to consumers that this is something that we as a society should value, that we as a society respect, honor, and award. And of course, it sends a very, very strong signal to aspiring journalists that this is the sort of thing that you can aim towards. You should try to produce, the quality of a Pulitzer, something. Why don't we try to break, global exclusives, that kind of stories. Singapore is a very important hub in the world for a number of different industries and sectors and finance. Very important things are happening in Singapore, and our journalists should be, pushed to go and cover these sort of things, to produce scoops and exclusives that would really resonate with our readers and our audience, and we can recognize that if we have something like the Singapore Pulitzer. So those are some of the ideas I've had, and I think we need to continue building the culture within the newsrooms and signal to them that this is where we're headed, this is what we really want, which is excellent, top quality journalism.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you, Mr. Fang, Prof. Lim, for your contributions here and also for your patience waiting for your turn to come up. We'll send you a transcript of these proceedings. If there are any errors or corrections, please correct them and send it back to us. So once again, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much, Chair, Ministers, members. Thank you.
Okay.
Happy Good Friday.
Thank you. Not almost. Yeah.